Resident Evil Extinction, a novelization by Keith R.A. DeCandido. Chapter 3. Before. Dr. Sam Isaacs stood in awe. It had been 3 weeks since the Umbrella Corporation had destroyed Raccoon City with a tactical nuclear missile. The news media had been awash with reports, initially of some kind of virus that had spread through the city prior to its destruction, then of a catastrophic nuclear power plant meltdown. As ever, Isaacs was impressed with his employer's ability to manipulate the truth. That, however, was not why Isaacs stood in awe. Only a small handful of people got out of Raccoon alive. To Isaac's great glee, his supervisor, Major Timothy Kane, was not one of them. But Alice Abernathy was. She almost wasn't. When they found her in the wreckage of a C-89 helicopter, she appeared to be one of two corpses, the other being Ian Montgomery, the copter's pilot. Montgomery had reported 4 other passengers, 3 adults and 1 little girl, but of them there was no sign. Alice herself had been impaled by a large slice of metal. She should have been dead. Now, 3 weeks later, she sat suspended in a tube filled with a nutrient bath, a breathing apparatus covering her nose and mouth. And according to Dr. Kyanan, she was about to wake up. "She's taking almost no nutrients from the system," Kyanan was saying, amazement in her brown eyes. "The regen seems almost spontaneous. It's like she's sucking energy out of thin air." Isaacs turned to look at the monitors in front of Kyanan's workstation. Not only was her EEG almost normal, but her metabolism was actually hypernormal, considering that she was little more than a corpse 3 weeks ago. He walked over to the tube. Alice's blue eyes sprang open just as he approached. "Can you hear me?" Isaacs asked. After a moment, the blonde head nodded yes. "Good." Now was the moment of truth. If past history was any indication, Alice would not take well to being studied, especially if she actually retained any memory of what had happened. But if she didn't recall what had happened, the possibilities were simply endless. However, there was really only one way to find out. Turning toward Cole, Isaac said, "Begin the purging process." Nodding, Cole started the sequence that drained the nutrient bath from the tank. Alice looked around as it happened, confused, not sure what was going on. Once the liquid was purged, the front of the tank opened like a flap, bringing Alice into a prone position on the floor. Lang, one of the security people, handed Isaacs a lab coat, and he offered it to her. She wrapped it around her shivering, naked form. "Her recovery is remarkable," Kyanan was saying, "and her powers, both physical and mental, are developing at a geometric rate." Isaacs did not acknowledge Kyanan. He'd read her reports after all, but instead sat next to Alice, brushing wet blonde hair out of her face and gently holding her hand. It was cool from the nutrient bath, but he could feel a vibrant warmth beneath. Alice shivered to the point of convulsion and kept looking around. Her mouth kept trying to form a word but couldn't get past a "wh" sound. Assuming it was the beginning of "where," Isaacs asked on her behalf, "Where are you?" He stood up, trying to guide her to rise as well. "You're safe. Come on." She got up slowly and stumbled once. She hadn't been on her feet in 3 weeks after all, and possibly didn't remember how to stand. He guided her over against a pillar so she had something to lean on. "That's it. There we are." Alice's blue eyes looked lost. Isaacs had only seen so blank an expression on newborns and animals before. It seemed as if she remembered nothing, which worked very much in Isaac's favor. Next to them, Doyle was looking at the readings on the nearby monitor and checking off items on a list on a clipboard. Alice started staring at Doyle's hands in fascination. Isaacs grabbed the clipboard and the pen and showed them to her. "Do you know what this is?" He spoke slowly, as if to a child. "It's a pen." He started writing on the checklist to demonstrate the instrument's function. "See? You try." He handed her the pen while holding the clipboard up to her. She gripped the pen as if it were a dagger and started drawing squiggly lines all over the checklist. "Puh." Again, she could handle only the first sound of the word. "Puh." "Pen," he prompted. Pen. Just like a small child, almost a tabula rasa. But still, he needed to be sure. More tests had to be run. First, the basics. He took the pen away and handed it and the clipboard back to a nonplussed Doyle. Then he grabbed Alice's wet head and said, "Look at me." She stared at him with baffled blue eyes. "Can you remember anything? Do you remember your name?" Blank stare, glancing around furtively as if trying to figure out what was wrong. Sam Isaacs had met Alice Abernathy only a few times before the hive incident, but while the person in front of him had the same facial features, it wasn't she. Ass-kicking Alice, as the cruder security division personnel had taken to calling her, was always in control of whatever situation she was in. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her body was like a coiled spring. The wet, confused woman standing in front of Isaacs right now was barely in control of her own twitchy movements. Her dull eyes weren't catching anything, and her body was like a wet rag. My name. She was repeating the words, not entirely sure what they might mean. Isaacs let go of her and walked toward Kyannan and Cole's workstations. He almost skipped, he was so giddy. He'd been living a nightmare for months, ever since that jackass Kane had been put in charge of his research. The Nemesis Project had been compromised beyond all recognition. The T-virus had gotten loose, first in the Hive, and then in Raccoon. The city had been destroyed, and Isaac's best hope for Nemesis, not to mention that nascent Tyrant program, had been impaled by a piece of metal. My name. But she'd recovered. Finally, he could move forward. I want her under 24-hour observation. I want a complete set of blood work and chemical and electrolyte analysis by the end of the day. My name... Sir, Cole started. Ignoring him, he couldn't possibly have anything of interest to say. Isaacs went on. Advanced reflex testing is also a priority. My name... I want her electrical impulses monitored. Sir, Cole said more forcefully. Sighing, Isaac asked, What is it? My name... Isaacs whirled around. The previous time she'd been muttering those two words almost as if they were a befuddled mantra. This time, though, she spoke with a deeper, more resonant tone, the tone of the head of security for the Hive. Is Alice. She flashed a smirk at Isaacs. And I remember everything. Isaacs quickly realized that Plan A wasn't an option. Moving faster than any human should have been able to move, Alice grabbed Doyle's pen and stabbed him in the eye with it. No, though her arm's momentum had to be incredible given the speed alone with which she moved it, she was able to stop the pen before it struck Doyle's eye. Isaacs found he was almost giddy over the prospect of what he could do with her. His disappointment at her memory returning was ameliorated by his own foresight. Alice then elbowed Doyle, knocking him to the floor. After that, Isaacs could barely follow what happened. She took out one, maybe two more people, and then before he could react, she grabbed Isaacs by the arm. Then she flexed her wrist. Isaacs had always thought stars forming in one's eyes from incredible pain was a fanciful creation of cartoon animators. Having his arm broken with but a flick of the wrist cured him of this misapprehension in short order. Glass cut into his hands and face as the tank shattered, and he fell to the floor covered in blood and glass. With knives of pain slicing through his shoulder and arm, Isaacs blinked back tears and tried to focus on what was going on. Cole and Kyanan had left. Doyle was still on the floor, as were Stolovitsky and Brunner. Lang had whipped out his taser and fired it at Alice. It struck her right in the shoulder. The taser glowed with an electrical charge that would have sent a normal person to the floor, twitching. Alice didn't move, or even blink. As hundreds of amps shot through her body, she just looked at the sharp end of the taser, ripped it out of her shoulder, rending flesh, but with no more effort than she would swat a fly, and then reared and threw the taser right back at Lang. It had somewhat more of an effect on the security guard, who screamed as he fell to the floor. And then she walked out. Isaacs tried to focus past the pain. It wasn't easy, but he had a very important task to perform. He knew he wouldn't be able to hold Alice if she remembered who she was, so he had to do the next best thing, let her think she was free. It was the same principle that applied to animals. Why try to keep them trapped in enclosures when you could let them run free and keep track of them in the wild? The advantage of working for the Umbrella Corporation was that one didn't have to rely on something so crude as a tag in the ear. Looking up at the security monitors, Isaac saw that Alice had not only made it outside, but was now in an SUV, alongside several other people dressed as personnel from Umbrella's security division. Isaacs recognized three of them instantly. One was Angie Ashford, the daughter of Dr. Charles Ashford, one of Umbrella's top scientists, and another casualty of Raccoon City. The other two were probably recognizable the world over as the fugitives who were allegedly responsible for the false video of strange, diseased people shambling through the streets of Raccoon City, infecting the populace. Carlos Oliveira, a former member of Security Division, and Jill Valentine, a former RCPD cop in their elite STARS section. With his good arm, he reached into his lab coat pocket, took out his phone, and signaled the front gate. Under other circumstances, Isaacs would have ordered security to stop them. Instead, he said only 3 words: "Let them go." After the guard disconnected, Isaac switched his phone over to interface with the mainframe and said 3 more words: "Program Alice activated." It would have been better if she had remained amnesiac. But Isaacs had known from the beginning that there was a better than even chance that she'd remember it all. After all, her mind worked better, faster than any human's. Unlike the other success the Nemesis Project had, Matthew Addison, who'd been mutated by the T-virus into a killing machine. Alice hadn't been changed by the T-virus. She changed it. But he'd never be able to hold her as long as she still carried her tiresome animus for her former employer. Unlike the late Major Kane, Isaacs actually planned for every eventuality and didn't just let chaos reign and hope he could rein it in later. A doctor came running in. "Are you all right?" she asked Isaacs, rather stupidly. Isaacs didn't dignify that with a response, but instead allowed her to help him to his feet and bring him to the infirmary. As she led him off, he said to Cole, "We'll need to purge this base. Relocate to the Detroit facility." They had gone to San Francisco more because of its proximity to what was once Raccoon City than anything. But the Detroit facility had better tracking equipment and was also the nerve center for directing Umbrella's massive network of satellites. He'd need them to keep track of Alice, and eventually to bring her home. Chapter 4. After. In 1956, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act, a pet project of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The act was designed to create a national system of highways that would make road travel throughout the United States faster and more efficient. Traditionalists, of course, decried the notion, as traditionalists always do. Allowing travelers to stay on lengthy stretches of highway meant they could, as John Steinbeck put it, drive from New York to California without seeing a single thing. Route 66, famed in song and story as the road across America, became, if not obsolete, at the very least reduced in significance in a world that valued speed. Why have a long, dragged-out trip through the small towns of Kansas when you could zip through it at 80 miles an hour? Sure, the speed limit was reduced to 55 during the gas crisis of the 1970s, but the cops didn't even give you a second look until you approached triple digits to get where you're going faster. Besides, they had to compete with airplanes, which really could take you from New York to California without seeing a single thing, save a few clouds. The main parts of the interstates were highways numbered with 2 digits according to direction and location. Odd-numbered highways ran north-south. Even-numbered were east-west. The numbers increased as you went north or east. I-5 intersected with I-90 in the Pacific Northwest, and with I-10 in San Diego, I-95 crossed I-10 in Florida, and I-90 in Boston. Arguably, the best-traveled interstates were the 2 longest, I-80, which went from New York to San Francisco, and I-70, going from Baltimore to Cove Fort, Utah. Because part of the 1956 Act's mandate was that the interstates go through all major U.S. cities, including through their downtown areas, there was an explosion in suburban populations. Suddenly, you didn't have to live in the city to work in the city, and towns outside cities became cities in their own right. Of course, not every city developed in that way. Take Salt Lake City, Utah, the capital of the desert state. It stood virtually alone. If someone drove west on I-80 through Utah, there was nothing until you reached the interchange with I-215. And then, all of a sudden, you were in a city. Just like that. Which was why Alice Abernathy was surprised as she rode her BMW K1200 west on 80 to see a sign reading Salt Lake City, city limits. She'd been riding on the highway for quite some time with very little signs of life. She hadn't realized she was so close to the city. Then again, the whole world had very few signs of life these days. The BMW was simply her latest ride. She'd had a chopper, but it washed out during a run-in with some undead back in Ohio. Alice had, of course, taken care of them, but it left her without a vehicle. She had had to walk from Youngstown to Cleveland suburbs. She avoided going near Columbus. That was her hometown, and to see it now would be just too painful. Before she found the BMW, left on the side of the road, its former owner decapitated and decomposing. Alice had seen no signs of the head, but the body was covered in bite marks, so it probably had been made undead and then killed by beheading. Whoever he was, he had good taste in bikes. The K1200 was the biggest, most powerful road bike in production, until they stopped producing road bikes, or much of anything else. Alice had made it all the way across the country on the BMW, scavenging supplies where she could. She had 6 saddlebags and gas cans, though the latter were mostly empty now, along with a radio receiver, all of which rattled about on the side of the bike as she weaved around abandoned, rusted cars and trucks. As she approached the exit for Foothill Drive, she found what she was looking for, the KLKB building. Alice could see as she got off the highway and headed toward the local independent TV station's parking lot that the patch of overgrown grass and flowers in front of the building once was a well-mowed lawn, with the flowers arranged to spell out the station's call letters. Desert sand choked the flowers in the sprinkler system, making the entire patch look like something a kid had started on the beach and then abandoned by half-heartedly kicking sand over it. Alice drove around 3 cars that were in various states of disrepair and at different angles to the pavement, and parked the BMW near the station's front door. Reaching up, she pulled the bandana down from her face. She didn't bother with a helmet. Ever since that bastard Isaacs had experimented on her after the hive disaster, every wound, every injury healed almost instantly. There was nothing a helmet could protect her from. She only wore the bandana because getting dirt, sand, and bugs in her mouth was irritating. Reaching into the pocket of the duster that she'd taken off an undead she'd killed in Joliet. She'd gotten a pair of sunglasses from him too, but they'd been broken in Cheyenne. She pulled out the digital memory stick she'd liberated from Umbrella's Detroit facility and put its earpiece in her left ear. It played the files she'd downloaded from the radio receiver, another gift from her brief time in Detroit, yesterday, when she'd left Cheyenne. The voice she heard was that of a woman, one who sounded desperate. Alice recognized the tone fairly easily. Most people had it these days. "This is KOKB, transmitting on the emergency frequency. Can anyone hear us? We have 7 people here in need of urgent medical attention. We've taken refuge in the TV station at the edge of town. We're surrounded and we need help. Can anyone hear us? Can anyone help us, please?" Alice switched it off. Then she looked around. The woman had said they were surrounded, but Alice saw no evidence of the undead in the vicinity. Thanks to Isaacs, whom she intended to flint if she ever saw him again. She had a sensitivity to the T-virus, and she had only a faint whiff of it here. That could mean that the undead had come and gone, or that they'd been killed, or that they were hiding. Of course, it was possible that in the 20 or so hours since Alice first picked up this transmission, the undead who'd surrounded them had stopped surrounding and started feeding, and then moved on to greener pastures. She inspected the station visually. All of the windows and doors were boarded up, those boards riddled with bullet holes. Whoever was in there, if anyone was in there, probably felt they were under siege. But then, a siege mentality was one of the few tenable strategies these days, and even a tenable strategy had only a 50-50 chance of succeeding. Alice headed to the front door, knocking both door and nailed-on boards down with one well-placed kick to the door's center. With a loud crack, the wood splintered at the impact of her boots, backed up by her T-virus-enhanced strength. Inside was an empty reception area. Her noisy entrance drew nobody out. The desk was still intact, although it was covered in blood, some of which had been used to clumsily draw various religious symbols. Looking around, she saw that those same symbols, only a few of which Alice recognized, covered the walls as well, obscuring the posters advertising the station's programming. She'd been a lifelong agnostic before. The advent of the T-virus made it clear to her that if there was a supreme deity, he was an evil bastard who didn't deserve to be worshipped. More likely, to Alice's mind, there were no gods, just people. And damn, but the people had effed things up. A whimpering sound caught her ear, and she moved slowly into the next room, pulling out her sawed-off 12-gauge. That next room was a studio, the set decorations scattered and shattered, with traces of dried blood everywhere, as well as more of the quasi-religious symbols sloppily drawn in blood on the walls and the equipment. Alice stepped over a battered, tipped-over camera as she moved to the corner of the studio where the whimpering noise was coming from. "My baby, my poor baby." Alice recognized the voice as the same one she'd picked up over the radio in Cheyenne. "Please." The woman was curled up in the corner of the studio, cradling a dirty blanket in her arms. Presumably the baby she was muttering about was swaddled in that rather sad bundle. She looked up at Alice, tears streaming down a dirty face, and held out the bundle. "Please help my baby." Her shotgun still in one hand, Alice reached out with the other to take the bundle. It felt like a dead weight, and Alice feared that the baby was a corpse. With a shudder, she wondered what would happen if the baby was infected. She'd seen plenty of small children who became undead, starting with the kids at Angie's school back in Raccoon, but never an infant, at least not yet. Angie. Shaking off those unpleasant thoughts, Alice pulled back the blanket to reveal a dead face, mostly because it was made of plastic. She'd been handed a doll. Before she could start to formulate a response to this crazy woman, she looked up to see that the woman had a shotgun. Alice dropped the doll to the floor and started to raise her own shotgun before she realized that they weren't alone. Without even looking, she knew that there were 5 other people surrounding her, all armed, all with their assorted weaponry pointed right at Alice. Based on the clicks, they were all cocked and ready to shoot. "You," the woman said with a nasty smile. "You dropped my baby." "Yet now you stop crying." Alice shook her head. "Must be getting old. Should have seen this coming." "Yeah, you really should have. Murph?" One of the men, whose face was pockmarked, lowered his pistol and walked over, holding a half-rusted pair of handcuffs. "My pleasure." He grabbed Alice and whipped her arms around. "You've done this before," Alice said calmly. "Used to be a state trooper. Till they fired me, anyhow. Said I was poorly socialized. At least, I think that's what they said. Don't remember much on account of I wasn't listening. That was my other problem. I don't listen too good." Once he slipped the cuffs on, he slammed her over what Alice figured was a news desk. "You're the prettiest fish we caught in a while." That confirmed what Alice suspected as soon as the trap was sprung. This was standard operating procedure for these people. She wondered what they did with their fish. She also figured she'd get the answer in fairly short order. As if to confirm, the woman put on the same tone she'd used over the radio. "We're surrounded. We need help. Can anyone hear us? Can anyone help us, please?" They all got a good laugh at that, all except for another of the men, a short one who also looked to be the youngest of the bunch. He was checking out Alice's 12-gauge, as well as her other weapons. "Look at these," the kid was saying. Murph walked over to take a closer look at the 12-gauge. "This fish is packing." A big man came over. Alice's eyes widened as she saw the 2 kukri blades in the large man's hands. She'd seen the Nepalese knives only once before, as part of the collection belonging to one of Umbrella's security higher-ups, who went by the code name of One. One had been killed during the hive mess, diced by the laser grid protecting the Red Queen computer, and his collection presumably was destroyed along with the rest of Raccoon City. Now these scavengers had themselves a pair. Alice wondered if they belonged to one of them, or if they'd taken them off a previous fish. Either way, she was looking forward to adding them to her arsenal once she killed these people, because she fully intended to kill every one of them. While she had walked into the KLKB station, fully intending to rescue whoever was trapped inside from the undead, now that she knew she'd been set up, Alice had marked every single one of them, not just for fooling her, but for distracting her from her real work. Alice was responsible for what had happened to the world. True, technically it wasn't her fault. Technically it was Spence who let the T-virus loose in the hive in order to cover his tracks while he stole the virus to sell to the highest bidder on the international market. But Alice had been partnered with Spence. They'd been assigned to run security at the mansion, which served as the primary access point to the hive. Not only had they been working together, they'd been sleeping together. Alice originally had trained with the Treasury Department, intending to be part of the Secret Service, before the institutionalized sexism of Treasury drove her to Umbrella. And part of that training was to be able to observe people and events. She had worked out that Lisa Broward, who ran security for Umbrella's computer system, was working to bring Umbrella down, and had worked to recruit her to join Alice's own efforts to bring Umbrella down. However, she missed Spence completely, and that nagged at her. If she had just figured out what Spence was up to and stopped him, most of the world's population still might be alive today. So she was determined to do what she could to help the few people who were left. Or at least those who deserved it. These jerks didn't qualify as far as Alice was concerned. The big man held up one of the kukris. "Let's see what else she's packing." He put the tip of the blade under Alice's duster. Looking the big man straight in the eye, Alice said, "I wouldn't do that." That got her a slap across the face. "Shut your mouth." It barely stung, and Alice hardly moved from the pathetic impact. If she weren't manacled, she could have taken these jerks down back when she was just a Treasury agent, much less now. She was definitely going to enjoy killing these people. Bad enough that there were so few people left, but they had to lure others for what? Their sport? The others seemed to think that the slap meant something, though. "That's it, Eddie," one of them cried. "You show her." "You show her," the woman with the baby added. Eddie smiled and, once again, positioned the kukri to slice open Alice's duster. Before he could start to do so, Alice reared one foot back and brought it up with a powerful kick right to Eddie's nose. The woman ran toward him as he fell to the ground. "Eddie! Eddie!" She knelt down next to Eddie, felt his neck, then looked up, giving Alice a murderous expression. "Jesus Christ, he's dead!" Alice shrugged as best she could while handcuffed. "I warned him." At that, the woman raised her own shotgun. "You!" "Hey," Murph said. "None of that, Margie. We do this same way we always do." Murph smiled then. "And this time, it'll be fun." Margie nodded, lowering the shotgun. "You're right, Murph. She probably did that so we'd shoot her. Put her out of her misery quick-like. But she ain't that lucky." That got a snort from Alice. She did it because she wanted Eddie dead. Period. Murph grabbed her arm and started leading her to another room. "Let's go, pretty fish. We gonna have us a show, boys and girls." Chris Murphy was going to enjoy this. The world had gone into the toilet, yeah, but hell with that, he was having fun. A lot more fun than he'd been having since before it all ended. That was for damn sure. Murph's daddy had been a state trooper, and his granddaddy before him, and his great-granddaddy before him. Where Murph grew up, it was like that Springsteen song, "They bring you up to do what your daddy done." So Murph, who used to like Springsteen's music until he got all political, applied to be a trooper when he turned 18. At first it was fine. Murph wasn't all that great at paperwork on account of he couldn't spell all that good, but neither could any of the other deputies, so he didn't fuss over that. But the sheriff, he fussed right good over the fights. They weren't nothing at first, just the usual brawls that happen when folks get into disagreements. But for some reason, Murph was singled out. Just 'cause that damn fool whose leg he broke turned out to be the mayor's kid. That wasn't hardly Murph's fault. Ain't like the little twerp was going around with a sign on his chest saying, "I'm the mayor's dumb kid." If he had, Murph probably wouldn't have popped him one for talking trash about Richard Petty. Or maybe Murph would have anyhow. Didn't nobody make fun of Richard Petty in his presence. Just wasn't done. Murph hadn't been a trooper long enough to get a pension worth a damn, and he didn't have no skills that nobody could use. His wife hit the road pretty much the minute he turned in his badge and gun. He moved to the city, figuring there'd be jobs in Indianapolis you couldn't get out in Carroll County, moving into some flea trap and taking jobs as a bouncer at a strip club. That worked out fine till one of the girls charged him with sexual harassment. Murph thought she was crazy, since all he was doing was appreciating her finer qualities, but didn't nobody believe him. So he strangled the little whore and left Indiana for good. Eventually, he wound up in Montana, and there he met up with some right-thinking folks who saw that the world was going into the toilet because of those big companies messing with the world. Their leader was a fella named Raymond. Murph had never gone for that pinko Greenpeace stuff, but this Raymond guy made sense, and he invited Murph to his bunker, so they'd be ready for when the world ended. Then the plague happened. Murph had never seen nothing like it. People get sick and die and then just get back up again and start eating people. They took down Raymond, and Murph got the hell out of Montana before they took him too. A bunch of Raymond's people came with, and they wandered around trying to stay alive until they met up with Eddie. Eddie was strong and smart. He knew the only way to survive in this new world was to take what you wanted. Salt Lake City was a ghost town after the plague wiped it out. So Eddie set up shop in an old TV station. Margie was real good at sounding all hysterical and stuff. So she'd get on the radio and call for help, and sure enough, some nut bar like this pretty lady would come to help. Murph had always liked Margie, going back to Montana, and she'd even let him bone her a few times, which was very neighborly. Weren't much by way of companionship these days, and you couldn't be fussy. Not that Murph ever had been. He'd bone anything with tits, even when he was married. Folks who were still alive and inclined to give aid to strangers these days were usually well stocked with food and medical supplies and the like. So the scam had been working pretty good, even nowadays with so many people gone. Murph didn't care, though. Only thing he missed was NASCAR. He'd seen on TV, back when TV was still running, that the entire Petty family had been taken down by the plague. It was a sight that would haunt Murph's nightmares till the day he died, seeing his hero brought low like that. It was a real shame. And now he missed Eddie. He was the leader. Same as Raymond was back in Montana. Same as the sheriff was back in Indiana. Murph had lost all of them, and he was still kicking. So maybe he didn't need people like that. In fact, maybe he'd be taking over this little to-do now that Eddie was dead. But that was for later. For now, he got to have fun. He grabbed the blonde fish and dragged her to the next room, then threw her head first down the hole. The hole had already been there when Eddie and the rest of them took over the studio, and since it led to the basement, it was the ideal place for the main events. Spiff, the kid, bent over and called down the hole, "Think you're pretty smart. Well, you'll see. You'll see." From up here, Murph could barely make the fish out. Only light down there came from topside through the hole. Made it more dramatic-like, Eddie'd said. Murph decided that when he took over, he'd make the hole bigger. It was more fun to see the whole thing. Electrical wires hung around near her, dangling from the ceiling. Murph figured that whoever was in the station before Eddie set up here had taken a bunch of equipment and the fixtures with him, leaving a lot of loose wires hanging around. Luckily, there wasn't no power to any of them. The fish looked around, and she saw the bones of her predecessors. Usually that was when they got all freaked out, but this fish was a cool customer. She just stared at the human remains for a second, like she saw skeletons every day. And who knew, maybe she did. And then looked around some more. Murph supposed that shouldn't been all that surprising, since she was cold as ice when she killed Eddie. But he figured that'd just make for a better show. Margie walked up to the edge of the pit and dropped down the keys to the cuffs, which Eddie thought was overdoing it a little. "There you go," Margie said as the keys hit the floor with a jangle. "Wouldn't want it to be over too fast." Murph was about to object, but then conceded the point. Besides, if this woman could do what she did to Eddie while tied up, she'd probably put up a good fight. And it'd be better if she had full use of her hands. The fish started crab-walking backward toward the keys. She moved pretty good for a lady all handcuffed. Usually, and Murph had experience in this regard, Folks could barely stand upright, much less move once their hands were behind their backs. It was why handcuffs was so effective that nobody had ever changed how you manacled prisoners since back to Roman times. That's what Daddy had always said. Murph didn't know if Daddy was right, somehow. Murph couldn't picture Roman soldiers in their sissy skirts and brushy-top helmets actually cuffing some guy in a toga, but he definitely believed in the power of the handcuff. With a clanging sound, the fish backed up against what she probably thought was a wall. Murph smiled. He loved this part. A snarling face with a bloody snout rammed into the cage, startling the fish. She backed away right quick. Murph muttered, "Was starting to wonder if anything'd spook her." "Don't worry," Margie said. "She'll be spooked enough in a minute." "Damn right." He looked over to Spiff and Navi. "Let 'em loose." The pair started pulling on the ropes that were attached by pulleys to the gates that kept the pooches in check. With a whining sound, the rusty metal gates opened, and Murph heard the sound that never failed to give him a thrill, the clacking of sharp paws on concrete. When they first got there, Eddie had 5 of the pooches. They were like the plague-ridden people, except they moved a lot faster, and they were, dogs. One of them died 3 months back when one of the fishes managed to snap its neck. That was the same fish who busted Avi's leg, and Avi had been limping something fierce ever since. Murph had no idea how Eddie'd managed to capture the pooches, but he did. And they'd been the source of entertainment for all of them for going on a year now. Watching them chew up the fishes was almost as much fun as NASCAR. The 4 that were left looked like hell, but that just made it more fun. The first one that came out was showing its entire rib cage, and its teeth were half broken and also covered in blood. At the right angle, you could see clean through its body, though the intestines got in the way of the full view. Next one to come out was even bigger and missing more skin, but that didn't stop it from clickety-clacking on the concrete toward the fish, who was scrambling with the keys Margie'd thrown down and stepping on the bones with her boots. "That's it," Margie cried. "Mess her up." And then the fish went crazy. The handcuffs clattered to the ground, and the fish got up and started doing some serious kung fu fighting. The pooches leapt right at her all at once, and she jumped out of the way, running along the walls, looking like Spider-Man or something. She did her some backflips, some side jumps. She even swung around the support beams like the dancers used to at the strip joint. With snarls and barks, the pooches kept jumping and leaping, but that couldn't get her. At one point, 2 of them came at her from opposite sides, and she went and ducked at the last minute. The 2 pooches collided head first and went to the floor, whimpering all sorry-like. But they kept getting closer each time. Murph bet that the fish could feel the pooch's hot breath on her pretty face, and sooner or later, they'd get her. Spiff had come over from the ropes and was watching alongside Margie and Murph and the rest of them. "The hell's she doing with them cables?" Murph hadn't noticed anything about the cables. He was just enjoying himself. Nobody had lasted this long without getting bit, not even the big guy who broke Avi's leg. Heck, this fish might be better than NASCAR. And then Murph realized what Spiff was talking about. The way she was jumping around reminded him of the girls in the club for a reason. Back then, he'd taken the job because he thought he'd get to see naked girls for free. But the novelty wore right off because they was all doing the exact same routine around the pole like 50 times a night. Got boring. This fish was also doing the same thing over and over with the support pillars and the pooches. And once Spiff started yapping about the cables, Murph figured it out. She was tying them to the cables, like this was on leashes in some backyard. Then pooches started yowling something fierce, tugging at the cables, and they wasn't going nowhere. Murph frowned. Something was wrong. The fish leaned against a wall, breathing a sigh of relief. Margie grinned. "Get her now! Get her now!" Then it finally hit Murph. Only 3 of them were tied up. The other pooch was lurking. Definitely as good as NASCAR. Out of nowhere, the last pooch leapt at the fish's back. A thrill of excitement ran through Murph. This always happened right before the big moment. He'd felt it when he beat up the mayor's kid, when he strangled that stripper, and every time the pooches got first blood. Except this one didn't. At the last second, faster than Murph had ever seen a human being move, the fish whirled around and slammed the heel of her hand into the pooch's head. It fell to the ground and it didn't move. It was dead for real now. Damn. Now they had only 3. And they was all tied up. Murph found himself torn between excitement at watching this all happen and worry about what they was going to do next. This fish had already lasted longer than anyone else had in the pit, and she'd tied up 3 pooches and killed the other one. "We may have to shoot her," Margie said, like she was reading his mind. Reluctantly, Murph nodded back. Heck, he might have asked her to join him. She'd be great at luring folks here, he bet, but after her killing Eddie, he doubted the others would go for it. He wasn't sure he was too keen on the idea, neither, but damn, she was something. Then the ground shuddered. "What the?" Murph blurted out without thinking. Then he put his hand to his mouth. Ah, hell, this was disastrous. About 2 years back, when everything went to the toilet, Murph made a promise to the Lord. He knew he was a sinner and that he was going straight to hell when he died, for the stripper if nothing else. But for whatever reason, the Lord had seen fit to let Murph live. In gratitude, Murph had promised him to go the rest of his days without cussing. He figured it was the least he could do. But when the ground shook like that, he spoke without thinking and cussed for the first time since he got to Utah. The ground shook again, and he looked down to see that the pooches were pulling against the support pillars, and them pillars, they was moving. Murph cried, "Get back! Get back!" Then the floor gave way under him. He jumped up, trying to grab at something, anything that would keep him from falling down into the pit. His meaty fingers managed to curl around a lighting fixture that was hanging from the ceiling. Clutching it for dear life, he looked frantically around, his feet dangling in midair, and then pushed himself off the light to a solid piece of ground a few feet from where he'd been standing. He looked around. Spiff, Margie, and Avi were all at various points in the room. Avi was on the floor, massaging his bad leg. "Y'all okay?" They all nodded. Avi said, "I'll live. What the hell happened?" "Look!" Margie was pointing down at the floor. Murph looked over and saw that the floor where he'd been standing had collapsed, falling downward at an angle into the hole that led to the basement. The fish could probably run right up that. Sure enough, that was what she did a second later. Murph scrambled around trying to find his semi-auto. Or, heck, Margie's shotgun, the fish's sawed-off, even those sissy blades Eddie carried. Anything he could use as a weapon against that woman. Before he could find it, she ran up, her boots slamming onto the wood. Murph was sure she was going to take him out the way she took out Eddie, but instead she grabbed the same light fixture he'd used and swung up to the grid on the ceiling. He lost sight of her a second later. "Damn," he said, shaking his head. He'd already broken his promise to the Lord, so what the heck. Besides, this struck Murph as a situation that called for some serious cussing. Especially when he heard a familiar clicking sound. Oh no. All of a sudden, the pooches came running up the ramp, cables trailing behind them, but not really slowing them down. One of them leapt right up at Murph, snout glistening with blood. Murph's last thoughts, as the pooch's teeth sank into his throat and ripped it out, were that he never should have started cussing. Alice sat crouching in the light grid of the KLKB television station and watched as her captors were torn apart by the very dogs they'd tried to kill her with. One tore apart Murph, the guy with the pockmarked face. Another chewed off the arm of Margie, the woman with the baby doll. All of them were literal dog food after a few minutes. Alice wondered how they had managed to keep them in check in the first place, and then realized that the one she'd killed, Eddie, was probably the ringleader, or at the very least, the dog wrangler. Once they were out of people to munch on, the dogs wandered around the television station for a while, and then headed out, instinctively moving to a place that was less empty of living human flesh to feed on. When they were gone, Alice jumped down, her knees bending with the impact as she landed on the damaged studio floor. Trying not to slip in the blood of her captors, she walked back into the room where she'd found Margie, and took her bike keys and her weapons back. She also grabbed the kukri blades. They were priceless and could be useful, particularly against the undead. Just as she stepped back out into the daylight, her watch beeped. Looking down at the battered Timex, she saw that she had only a minute before the satellite would be overhead. As the watch beeped down, 59, 58, 57, 56, she ran to the BMW and pulled a desert camouflage tarpaulin out from one of the containers that dangled from the side of the bike. After laying the bike down on its side, she whipped the tarp out to full size and draped it over the bike. Then she threw some of the sand that had blown into the parking lot and the grass onto the tarp to make it look less conspicuous. Between that and the bike being on its side, it wouldn't jump out as being a bike. 25, 24, 23. Shrugging out of her coat, she ran to the doorway to KLKB, dusting the ground behind and in front of her to eliminate any evidence of footprints. 10, 9, 8. Finally, she crouched in the doorway, covering herself with the duster, hoping it would look only like someone's coat that had been blown into the doorway by the wind. 3, 2, 1. Then she waited. She hated this part. Time slowed to a crawl, and she was afraid to move. True, she'd been trained to stay absolutely still if need be, training that went back to when she started taking karate as a teenager in Columbus, and which the T-virus enabled her to do with ridiculous ease. But her ability to rid her mind of all thought, the way Sensei had taught her, had lessened of late. There was simply too much in her mind to clear it all out, and most of it was death. After several dozen eternities, the watch beeped again. That meant that Umbrella's satellite was no longer overhead. She could come out. Within minutes, she was back on her BMW, the tarp having been folded back into its carrier, and the kukris now alongside her other weaponry. Firing the bike up, she got back onto 80 and headed into Salt Lake City. Big cities were dangerous. They had many enclaves of undead, hidden in buildings and other odd places, but they also had lots of supplies that might still have gone unlooted. It was certainly worth a look, since she was already in town.